Okay, hi. I'm Ameera. I'm from Malaysia, from IIUM. Okay, I have no idea if that just went live or if it was live like 10 seconds ago, but in case it wasn't live 10 seconds ago, again, back to my introduction. My name's Ameera. I'm from IIUM, that's in Malaysia. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk on Islamic terrorism and radicalization. Specifically this topic because I feel like based on my exposure maybe for the past 24 years, I feel like there are some useful insights that I may have out of being raised in a Muslim environment for the past 24 years that might be useful for future debates that either talk about, Sunni Shia conflicts, or whether it's about ISIS, or whether it's just about the Middle East conflict that highly revolves around Islamic terrorism. How I'm going to structure this lecture is, firstly, I'll talk about what is Islamic terrorism, which should be quite self-explanatory, but I'll just go into a little bit more detail. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about the different types of Islamic terrorism that exists. And then thirdly, I'm going to go into more of like radicalization and why it likely happens, what are the contributing factors to it, and what are the things that we could do to sort of counter that. And if you guys have any questions, I'm not entirely sure how this thing works, but I've been told that you can submit questions and I'll try to answer it. Sort of like me giving a speech and you guys asking me POIs. Okay, so Islamic terrorism. So basically, Islamic terrorism is an extreme version of understanding Islam. And like many other religions, the thing about the holy text is that it's always open to interpretation, and people have different ways of interpreting it. And I guess Islamic terrorism is a result of the more extreme interpretations of it, whereby people end up taking arms to propagate Islam. In the name of Islam, they believe in violence. They feel that this is one of the only ways whereby you can fulfill God's mandate. The term that Muslims use is jihad, which literally means struggle. And I think that Islamic terrorists have sort of taken jihad out of context, in a sense that they think the only way to do jihad, which is supposedly the obligation of every single Muslim out there, is by taking up arms. Whereas the thing about jihad is you can do jihad in multiple ways. Like you can even do it in peaceful ways. Debating, in fact, is considered as jihad, which is why IIUM encourages it so much, because what it means is that you are struggling and you were trying to show Islam in a good light. And if debating shows that Muslims can agree to disagree, or whatever forms of conflict that you have, to not resolve it through a violent manner, but to do it through intellectual discourse. The fact that a person can be kind, and for that to make it seem as if being a Muslim is attractive, that in and of itself can be jihad. Point is, Islamic terrorists tend to take jihad in its most extreme form and, sort of set out the stereotype. And as a result, people end up getting so scared when they hear the word jihad, thinking that that immediately means violence, when that's not necessarily true. It's a distortion of what the word jihad actually means. Secondly, is talking about the different types of Islamic terrorism. So obviously, the more popular one that we've seen in recent news are groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And these are usually groups that want to establish a caliphate, or, well, specifically ISIS. They want to establish an Islamic world. They believe in the ultra-conservative interpretation of Sharia-based governance. And they take it upon themselves that it is their mandate to spread it across the world. So these are people who believe in an Islamic world and make it their objective to spread Islam in that form. The second type of Islamic terrorism are groups that do believe in Sharia, but rather than going into different countries and trying to spread out their ideologies, the way they work is at a much more localized sphere. So an example of this would be the Boko Haram, whereby they believed in the interpretation of Islam, whereby women are second-class citizens. They don't deserve education. And the whole point of Boko Haram was to say that women ought to not get education in Nigeria. So it's sort of, they believe in Islam, but they don't go out of their way to spread it. It's rather kicking out Western sentiments within their country, and they believe that education for women is a form of Western ideology that they're trying to kick out. So the third type of Islamic terrorism is groups that are supposedly seen as freedom fighters by some individuals. So it's more political more than it is religious, if you ask me. So for example, groups like Hamas, they don't necessarily function to establish an Islamic state. Maybe they're more concerned with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but by virtue of being Muslims, we identify them as Islamic terrorists. So they carry out terrorist activities, but they don't necessarily have like an Islamic objective in a sense that they want to establish a caliphate. So it's more political. I think another example of that probably would be like the Hezbollah, that are more Shia-based than Sunni-based. Although they do have other minority groups in Hezbollah, but they are primarily Shia. And so the same thing, they have more political motivations, but they're also seen as an Islamic terrorist group. More specifically, they're seen as Shia militias. And then lastly, you have groups that, because if you notice, terrorist groups don't always stay in these boxes. They move around because obviously their agendas evolve as well. And I think a perfect example of this would be the Taliban. What started off as a much more localized group, in Afghanistan, with wanting to kick out Russian influence or American influence, that quickly evolved into having an Islamic agenda overall, even though they're no longer in the era of supposedly dealing with Russian invasion or American invasion. And yeah, so I think it's important to keep in mind the sort of terrorist groups that you're talking about, just to know what exactly are their goals, which is why it's not true that they, just because they're all terrorist groups, they somehow support each other. That's not how it works. Yeah, so those are the different types of terrorist groups. I think another thing that maybe is important to recognize here, and maybe now I'm going a little bit more into the part that I said I would do at the end, but I think it just makes more sense structure-wise for me to talk about it now, which is another thing that I feel people tend to confuse themselves with is the difference between Wahhabism and terrorism. Both are radical, both are conservative, but they do not mean the same thing. So Wahhabism and terrorism are, from a third-party perspective, we think that one leads to the other. But when you're speaking from their perspective, they're actually at war with each other. So Wahhabism are very conservative groups. Like, think about some of the ultra-conservatives that exist in Saudi Arabia. Like, they hold the establishment, they benefit out of people not challenging the structures of the religion. They believe in the conservative forms of Sharia, and they believe in Sharia law, and perhaps they don't implement it in the most just manner. So obviously, we debaters look at it as, if you believe in all of those things, it's very easy for you to fall into the trap of terrorism, because essentially that is what terrorists believe in. And the thing is, terrorists are trying to fight Wahhabis, and Wahhabis are trying to fight terrorists. So an example of that would be like how Saudi Arabia obviously doesn't want to let ISIS in, which is why they're supposedly getting stricter with their immigration. But at the same time, although they have similar traits, I guess, by virtue of being radical, terrorists try to fight Wahhabis because, if you notice, if you look at ISIS, what they're trying to do is fight the establishment, because they're saying that the establishment, are giving too much to the West. They're making too many compromises. They're corrupt. They talk about Sharia, but their monarchs and those individuals who hold positions of power are immune to the Sharia. You can't trust in your establishment anymore. And perhaps some of the things that they are saying are true, that the establishment is corrupt, but that isn't to say that, terrorists themselves suddenly are like the bastions of humanity or anything like that. But basically, Wahhabism and terrorism, very similar characteristics, but one way to maybe remind yourself of the difference is that one is the establishment, one is anti-establishment. Okay, now moving on to, I think, more arguments that you can use in debates. And just a disclaimer, some of the things that I'm saying probably are not a reflection of what my institution nor my country or Islam as a religion feels. This is just more of my own perspective and my own thoughts that I think could be relevant in debates. And the arguments that I'm going to present to you could be used either in Gov or Ob, purely depending on the topic. But these are just some ideas that I would like to throw out there for you to utilize for EUDC or any other tournaments that you may be attending. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the contributing factors that exist for Islamic radicalization that eventually leads to Islamic terrorism. So I think firstly, one of the contributing factors as to why I think people end up trapped in terrorism or radicalization, I think, is the need to find identity, in a sense that some people, like you know how we run in debates the argument that religion gives us a sense of purpose, and a lot of the times individuals feel a lot more belonged in a community, the point at which they believe in religion. So all of those benefits and that same characterization could be run as to why some individuals end up getting trapped in radicalization, because perhaps sometimes they feel a little bit conflicted with with the more mainstream religion, or maybe they feel conflicted with not having religion present in their thought process, that sometimes they're just trying out different identities, and they discover that by virtue of the rising of terrorism, it makes it seem as if it's a valid option to explore. As a result, they tend to look into it. And I'm not saying that it's because individuals just naturally look for terrorism or radicalization, but it's because terrorists prey on people who are vulnerable. Terrorists prey on people who seem hopeless, or seem like they're lost, or seem like they're lonely. And like, I've had some conversations with some of my friends who have links with people who they know are going down that path of radicalization. And it's oftentimes, they tell me that it is those people who they don't have much of a support structure, and individuals who are already part of the radical group reach out to them and say, why don't you come into our group? We'll provide you that support structure. We're here to provide you with that identity. And I think by virtue of being vulnerable and being lost and feeling like there is no other identity out there for you, whether it's, by the fact that other people don't really try to engage in a conversation with you and realizing that you're lost, and the fact that terrorists come in and try to exploit that. Point is, I think that when an individual is lost and they're looking for identity and they're vulnerable, and radicalization seems like an option because of the rising of radicalization, and when radical individuals come in and exploit that, I think that's a very dangerous atmosphere to be in, and part of the reason why some people get trapped into it. And I think the second extension to that is not just on a abstract, I need identity kind of a thing, but I think it's also about survivability. I think it's very true when individuals who feel like they have been struggling in this capitalist structure, and if they feel like the state has failed them, and they can't depend on the state for survivability, I think in developing countries, it's very true that terrorist groups come in and try to act like they are the heroes, and they are the ones providing you food and sustenance and protection. And I think out of sheer desperation and wanting to survive, I think individuals tend to buy into the ideologies of that group because they feel like they have no other choice, but to do that in order to survive. So I think that's the second reason why, on an individual level, why some people get trapped into radicalization. I think the third reason of why some people end up getting trapped in radicalization is actually because of a skewed understanding of what terrorists look like. I think while terrorists deserve to be vilified, and they're not good for anyone in society. I think that by virtue of us constantly talking about how they are barbaric individuals, like, I think the way we characterize it and the way media characterize it by overly exaggerating, well, not exaggerating, I mean, probably they are accurately talking about the atrocities and the harms of which these terrorist groups are propagating. But what I'm trying to say is, where we always have this understanding that terrorist groups are supposed to look like barbaric individuals, we kind of don't realize a terrorist once they're standing in front of us and they don't fit into that profile that we understand. Like, they don't have a long beard, or they don't constantly, talk about religious things all the time. And it happens all the time, because I recently heard from one of my close friends that one of his friends actually was involved in ISIS and was actually unfortunately killed in one of the terrorist attacks that happened back in his home country. And he was surprised because that friend was very funny. Like, that friend would talk about, the typical things that you would talk about with your friends: dating, social media, gossip, what's the latest trend. And never in his mind did he think that this person could be a terrorist. So I think it's worth diving into religious discussions with people, even when on the surface it looks like, they're pretty chilled, they're pretty cool, because terrorists don't always look like what the media portrays them to be. Some of them look like your best friend, like, as in, they don't fit into the stereotypical profile. So I think the point at which we are more aware of that, we become more aware of the sort of individuals that we're dealing with. And as a result, perhaps you can not assume that just because a person seems cool, that they would suddenly they would be on the same page with you when you're talking about religion as well. And I think fourthly is the reason, another contributing factor towards Islamic radicalization, I feel, is that, so as much as Islam is open to interpretation, I find it very odd that the solution to that by some imams is by offering a solution that is equally open to interpretation. So for example, following God's words, like, God literally sent you the Quran, which is like this thick. Like, he's got a lot to say. And many things are open to interpretation, especially when one verse seems to be in tension with the other. But when you have imams coming up and saying things like, oh, don't worry, because know that the true Islam is the Islam that remains true to Sharia. Like, what does Sharia even mean? Because Sharia is equally open to interpretation, right? And I feel that it becomes very problematic when people talk about Sharia and saying, oh, this person's Sharia compliant and that person's not Sharia compliant, without actually explaining what Sharia is. Whereas Sharia in and of itself, if you ask me, just means following what God wants. So it kind of is equally confusing when an imam tells you, don't worry, because the true way of following what God wants you to do is by doing what God wants you to do. Because when they say stuff like the true Islam is one that follows Sharia, and when Sharia is open to interpretation as well, it becomes very difficult, because clearly the ones that keep on talking about Sharia and the one that keeps on saying that we are the ones that are remaining true to Sharia are the terrorist groups, because they're very unapologetic about the way they perceive Sharia and the way that they want Sharia to be implemented. Whereas if you talk about the modern context, like if you're talking about countries, like some countries will implement Sharia like 50%, and the other 50% they will say that, well, Sharia is a little bit irrelevant for us to implement in today's world, because we need to adapt with the fact that we live in a multi-religious, multicultural society. And the problem with that is that many individuals on the ground, when they hear imams saying that the true Islam is one that stays true to Sharia, but on the other hand, sees that their own government says that they can't commit to Sharia because they need to adapt to a multicultural society, then they end up believing that their government is no longer remaining true to Islam. And as a result, if you are a person that needs true Islam and true Sharia, you end up buying into the rhetoric of ISIS. And ISIS benefits a lot out of your local mosques that keep on talking about Sharia and saying how, you know, you need to go back to your roots and remain true to Islam. Because I think what individuals can do instead, what governments can do, is say that you're remaining true to Sharia while being tolerant at the same time. So because Sharia is open to interpretation, what you could have done was probably say that being more inclusive of other religions, being more inclusive of other cultures, that in and of itself is Sharia compliant, rather than assuming the moment you include people of different backgrounds, that means that you're non-Sharia compliant, right? So I think perhaps either co-opt in those interpretations of Sharia and saying why that is true to Islam, or just be more specific in the sort of advice you would give to your congregation when it comes to trying to moderate them, as opposed to like giving open-ended statements that would allow individuals to just hijack it and use it to their convenience. Fifth thing is, I think that another contributing factor to Islamic radicalization is, while I think it's fair for moderate Muslims to obviously dissociate themselves from extreme Muslims like terrorist groups, to be able to identify themselves and say that I don't believe in that ideology, while I think that that is a right of moderate Muslims, I also think that the over-dissociation of Islamic terrorist groups by saying that that is not Islam has kind of contributed to the problem, in a sense that you're less willing to introspect on your own religion and kind of look back at the mistakes that your local mosques have made in terms of probably making some contributing factors to why some individuals in that locality ended up becoming radical. Because the point at which you keep on saying that's not Islam, and you're constantly putting blame on that other individual, you're less willing to kind of realize that maybe you had a stake in contributing to some of those problems. So while I think dissociating yourselves from terrorists is a good thing in terms of being able to identify yourself as a non-terrorist, I think that that shouldn't come at the expense of introspection of your own religion and what your local mosques are saying. And I think lastly, just in terms of like contributing factors, I think that another contributing factor to radicalization is the fact that Islam is an organized religion. Again, the things that I'm saying are not things that I genuinely believe in 100%, but it's more of things that I think you can run in debates. I think it's worth exploring, which is that organized religion can be pretty effed up, in a sense that because organized religion is hierarchal, it also means that there are people in lower ranks who are trying to prove their loyalty to individuals who are on the upper ranks. And some of those things include acts of radicalization and acts of terrorism in order to show that you are willing to do anything for your religion and to impress the person who are sitting in those higher positions. And I think the second bad thing about just like the organized religion as a structure and why it opens up room for some radicalization is that some of the things you are required to do when it comes to terrorism and radicalization doesn't seem intuitive, right? Like killing doesn't seem intuitive at all. But when there are individuals who are religious leaders who tell you it's okay to do this, it kind of gives those individuals validation. Like, okay for you to do this thing. There is somebody reaffirming that it is all right for me to kill in the name of religion. And that can only happen in an organized structure of religion, because you obviously want to seek direct validation, and clearly you can't communicate with God. Like, God's not going to tell you whether it's right or wrong. But by virtue of believing that if somebody who is in a higher position tells you it's okay, and out of the sheer belief that somebody who is of a higher rank has like better connections with God, you know, the bad things, the bad thoughts that you had in your mind gets reaffirmed, and then those thoughts get translated back into action, and many times those actions look in the form of radicalization. So in terms of what are, and going back to this whole organized religion thing, which is like exactly why sometimes you come across motions in debating tournaments that say stuff like, this house believes that organized religion provides no room for feminism, or will never be female friendly. And it's because, not just because, you know, you don't see female leaders, female religious leaders in these organized religion, but think about the structure of organized religion, and by virtue of Islam also being an organized religion, it is because many times when it comes to actions, not just killing, but like discrimination towards women, discrimination towards gay individuals, like all of these actions don't seem intuitive, but the point at which you realize that there is somebody else who is validating those wrong actions, you think it's okay. So like that's another characterization that you could run in motions that specifically talk about organized religion. So in terms of what are the things that you could do to counter terrorism and radicalization, is that I think firstly, more recognition that your religion could be at fault. Not saying that your religion encourages terrorism, not saying that Islam encourages terrorism, but there are some verses in the holy text or some of the sayings that, you know, Islamic religious leaders say that could very well be misconstrued as validating terrorism and radicalization. Like, perhaps the sooner you recognize that these verses exist, the sooner you're willing to address it, rather than constantly being in denial and saying, no, that's not what it means. No, that's not in end of discussion. But, you know, identifying that the fact that the holy text does say adulterers need to be killed, or that, you know, Islam has no room for homosexuality. And if you notice, these verses are not things that only terrorists or radical individuals believe in. Even the average Muslim, right? They may not be terrorists, but I can promise you that majority of Muslims are not people who will join the gay parade and will tell you that they're perfectly okay with like homosexuality or feminism or premarital sex. Like, the fact that there are many beliefs in Islam that are somewhat radical in like at its core, I think that the sooner we realize that maybe Islam as the religion as a whole can either explain what they mean by that, or perhaps even recognize that maybe it's about time that religion evolves and no longer, you know, use those part of the text in its most literal interpretation. I mean, if religion can evolve over time, if there was once upon a time where people believed in Islam that women cannot work because of the holy text that says that there are roles for women and that they are supposed to stay at home and take care of their family, and while that's an admirable job, that still says that women can't work elsewhere out of their homes. But if Islam can move forward from that, why can't Islam move forward from, you know, other things like recognizing other genders, or recognizing other sexual preferences, or recognizing certain private activities that individuals should be able to do without being condemned to hell? So I think the sooner we recognize that there are those some verses that actually are in the holy text and actually do contribute to radicalization, and, you know, figure out what we feel about that and evolve from that, then, you know, maybe we'd be moving forward. Secondly is, I think the way to counter the argument that religion, Islam being open to interpretation and having solutions that are equally open to interpretation and that being a bad thing, I think you can flip it in all, right? You can be like, no, actually it being open to interpretation is a fantastic thing. Like, the only reason why we have so many liberal sects or different schools of thought, even in the conservative pocket, like how you have the Shafi'i school of thought, which is supposedly the more ultra-conservative group, and then you've got the Hanafi school of thought, which is in the conservative pocket, but on the liberal spectrum of that conservative pocket. And all of this is only possible because Islam is open to interpretation. And that means that you can equally validate more of the liberal interpretation without believing that you're a deviant, right? Because you can always find something in the Holy Scripture that can verify your beliefs are equally Islamic as the next person who claims that women who don't wear the hijab are condemned to hell. You can also find another scripture, like another verse in the Holy Scripture that equally says, you know, a woman has her right and she's not going to go to hell just because she doesn't wear the hijab. And that can only be possible if it's open to interpretation. And it doesn't just have to be about like groups. It can even be like from an individual perspective. Like if you are a person who believes in Islam, but you feel that there are many things that come naturally to you that are deemed as un-Islamic according to, you know, the more mainstream version of Islam. If there are so many different versions of Islam, if there is like, if there are Sunnis, if there are Shias, if there are you know, Wahhabis, if there are Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'is, all of these different schools of thought, and all of them can find validation in Islam, then perhaps your one interpretation, even individually speaking, could well possibly be equally true. So you don't have to feel bad about yourself. And I think that that's a good thing if you have Islam being open to interpretation. And I think this whole Islam being open to interpretation is a good thing, because you're kind of, it can also, like if you reframe that argument, it can also be a counter towards the hierarchal problem. Because initially I said that part of the reason why people can validate wrong interpretations is because you have somebody to reaffirm that, and that somebody is holding a higher position in religion. But if everything's open to interpretation, then you can kind of counter that hierarchical problem by saying that, you know, why is that person's interpretation more true than mine? Like we're both equally Islamic. Neither one of us had a session with God where we sat down and had a chat about what the verse actually meant. So that could be equally true. And then I think the next thing that you can talk about in terms of what you can do to counter radicalization is, I think, just making sure that the state provides for good welfare for the people. Because I think that if you're talking about many developing countries, many terrorist groups are tapping into individuals who are most vulnerable, and not just in terms of identity, but also in terms of not having a sustenance or protection. Because when individuals feel like states are no longer protecting them, and states have failed them, they're going to turn to another entity that is closer in proximity, and you know, will say that they can better provide for that individual and their family. And then I think lastly, what you can also talk about is, I think also just learning to engage with individuals. Like, I think don't shy away from conversations about religion, because I think the same way with politics, I noticed that many people shy away from the conversation of politics. Like if we step out of our debate bubble, not everybody outside finds a chat about politics to be very pleasant. Instead, they feel that it can be very confrontational. So I think that if individuals can learn to talk about religion in a non-confrontational manner, it can, you know, perhaps give you a better insight of the person you are interacting with and whether or not that person might fall into radicalization. And in the event that, you know, you happen to disagree with their interpretation of religion, just like don't shut them out. Because I think this is important also to, again, going back to not just assuming that just because a person seems cool and chill, that immediately means that the person is not going to get trapped into radicalization. Because I think a perfect example of this would be like how I like in a certain religious institution, and I'm not going to mention which religious institution, I have a friend who seemed very cool, right? Like he does spoken poetry, does rap, talks about Kanye West, super cool, goes to all these theaters. And then when you finally indulge in a conversation about religion with them, you suddenly realize that they're an ISIS sympathizer. And you know, you need to, I mean, obviously it's shocking, but you still need to indulge in that conversation with them and sort of like, you know, persuade them back. I mean, that's the whole point about debating, right? Like debating can't just possibly be about winning in tournaments, but it's also about sort of taking the good values out of debating and implementing it in the real life. And I think one of the ways that individuals can actually do that is by engaging in conversations about religion with individuals, and then just sort of try to pull them back into a much more moderate interpretation of that religion. And again, all the things that I am saying are things that, if you feel that they're relevant to you in the real world, good for you. Otherwise, most of the things that I'm saying are just things that I tend to throw around in debates. Like I talk about how, you know, you, like the argument about how you want to make sure that states don't fail because the point at which states alienate minorities, or the point at which minorities feel more discriminated, more vulnerable, they're probably going to fall into a bigger trap of terrorism and radicalization. That's one argument that I'm very sure could apply in many, like multiple debates. Secondly is, you know, you can extend that argument by also talking about identity and not just about like financial survivability per se. Thirdly, you can talk about the whole organized religion thing and why organized religion in and of itself is can be bad. And that's not just Islam, honestly. You can talk about that in any other organized religion, whether you're talking about Christianity or whatever, right? And then I think fourthly is the whole overly dissociating yourself. Like if you're talking about from an Islamic perspective, like why it's bad to claim that something is not Islam. These days, what is latest in the news is how people no longer want to call ISIS ISIS because they feel that that gives ISIS legitimacy by calling it Islamic State. It's sort of the name that ISIS wants to be called by, or the fact that it's still associating the word Islam to the group, and why that's bad because supposedly ISIS is non-Islamic, that people would prefer calling them Daesh, which basically means to cause disunity. And that obviously pisses ISIS off because like they obviously don't see themselves as the cause of disunity. And people have debates about that because they actually think that on one hand, while you don't want to call them something that they want to be called by because like they shouldn't have a right to self-identify, perhaps calling them Islamic terrorists would push Muslims to feel more of an urgency to realize that Islamic terrorism does to a certain extent stem from some Islamic interpretations and some Islamic texts that actually do exist in the Islamic religion, and perhaps some introspection is needed, right? And I think these are multiple arguments that you can use in any Islamic debate. And I'm very sure this is not an exhaustive list. And if you have any other questions, feel free to message me. I think I would be able to come up with more arguments if I had like an actual motion that would probably help me and you churn out more arguments. But if you have any questions, whether it's about debating in general or whether it's about specifically any Islamic topics or even just general questions about Islam, I'm not claiming to be an Islamic expert, but I will give you my perspective as the average person. Or as a debater. And you can either do that by messaging me on Facebook, and my name on Facebook is Ameera Natasha Moore, or you can just email me. I'd like to think I'm quite responsive over Gmail. My Gmail is meramoore@gmail.com. Any questions at all, I'll be happy to answer. All right, so I hope you guys found this useful.